Money is said to change people, but isn't it just revealing their true nature? Watching my husband Thomas in front of me, I couldn't help but think so.
With this much, we could quit our jobs and buy a house. Yes. Maybe take Dad and Mom on the trip they've been wanting to go on.
Thomas starts planning as if the money I inherited from Dad was his own. Moreover, his plans even include my despised in-laws.
This is something Dad left for me. You have no right to dictate how this money should be used.
It was a cry from my heart. But Thomas scoffed and waved his hand. All your money is my money. Oppose me and it's divorce. Typical Thomas. He thinks if he says this, I'll comply. By threatening so, Thomas left the house. Things have changed. It can't go back to how it was before. I decided to start preparing something while Thomas was away. I'm Lily, 30 years old. Since graduating from vocational school, I've been working at a private clinic's reception. I married Thomas 3 years ago. We met at a friend's wedding. Initially surprised by Thomas's somewhat pushy demeanor, the comfort of him being a friend allowed our relationship to progress to dating. And eventually to marriage. I'll make you happy. It was a bit presumptuous, but I was genuinely happy. At that time, I dreamed of a happy married life. But I quickly woke up from that dream. Before marriage, Thomas would spend weekends at my place or we'd go out. Which is why I hadn't noticed. I never imagined Thomas would be so attached to his home, and that his in-laws would dote on him so much. A wife is not a guest. A line I've heard annoyingly too many times. Mother-in-law Evelyn has been drilling it into me every time I visit the in-laws' house since we got married. It's not like I was lounging around or acting high and mighty. But since Evelyn pointed it out, I've been even more cautious. As soon as I arrive at the in-laws' house, I put on an apron.
Can I carry this? Is it all right if I wipe the table?
And ask Evelyn. It's more exhausting than work. I've never once had Evelyn make me coffee. Father-in-law Charles and Thomas would look at me and chuckle. Still got a way to go. I was fed up with the whole in-laws household. If it were just a few times a year, I could somehow bear it. But in Thomas's case, it's every week.
Before marrying Lily, I lived at home, so I prioritized Lily on weekends. But now that I live with Lily, weekends are for prioritizing Dad and Mom.
Unfortunately, our apartment is just a 10-minute drive from the in-laws' house. Because of this, there are times when Thomas is at his parents' house even on weekdays. Moreover, the apartment Thomas and I are living in is the one I used to live in alone. We got permission from the landlord, but it's cramped for 2 people. Hey, shouldn't we look for a bigger apartment? I suggested right after we got married, but the response I got was terrifying.
It costs money, and instead of doing that, why not live together at my parents' house?
The thought of spending 365 days in that in-laws' house made me feel sick. Absolutely not. I haven't mentioned moving to Thomas since then. It seemed like Thomas could feel the air of me being uncomfortable around Evelyn, and I often got scolded by him.
Sure, Mom might be strict, but isn't that just how moms are? Well, maybe you wouldn't understand since you don't have a mom, Lily.
Whenever the conversation turned to my parents, I always felt looked down upon by Thomas. I was raised in a single-parent household. My mom passed away when I was young, so I was raised by my dad. I once heard from my dad when he was drunk that he and my mom had eloped. As a result, we had no relatives to rely on. Moreover, my dad was running a company and was very busy. So, in reality, it was a housekeeper who took care of me. The housekeeper was kind but still a stranger. I couldn't genuinely open up and have come this far without doing so.
It's a pity, though. It would have been nice if your dad had been a bit better at business,
Thomas would say, seemingly pleased. I don't like this topic, but for some reason, Thomas occasionally brings it up as if he just remembered. It's about my dad's company going under. My dad closed his company a few years ago. I don't know the details, but it probably went under due to financial difficulties. It happened around the time I decided to get married. Worried about my dad.
Want to live together?
I asked him. I knew Thomas would oppose, but I couldn't leave my dad alone. However, in the end, my dad chose to live by himself.
Don't worry about me. Just think about your happiness.
But
nothing makes me happier than knowing you are living happily. Oh, and congratulations on your marriage again.
I can still vividly remember that kindly smiling face to this day. I wished I could have shown him his grandchild, but unfortunately, we hadn't been blessed with children. 2 years into our marriage, finally prompted by Evelyn, I underwent medical examinations. The results showed there was nothing wrong with me. That meant there might be an issue with Thomas. Thinking this, I asked him to get tested once. Every time I met Evelyn,
a useless woman who can't even bear a grandchild,
she would say. But Thomas adamantly refused. No way.
I'm not an animal. It's shameful to have to go through tests like that.
I was practically forced into it by Evelyn. I had no say in the matter. Thomas knew this, yet. Please.
If there's no issue, we can rest easy, and if there is, we can treat it.
I just want to know. The pressure from Evelyn is immense. Thomas shook his head.
What? You want me to get tested just because you feel pressured by Mom? It's not like that. I thought if there's a solution. There's no solution to a blessing. You just hate Mom's nagging. That's your problem, not mine.
No matter how much I pleaded, Thomas refused to get tested. He knew I was struggling with Evelyn's pressure and nagging. He didn't offer any support. Whenever I brought it up,
that's your problem, not mine,
he would dismiss it. Weekdays were for work and household chores. Weekends were for visiting the in-laws' house. This routine left me completely exhausted. I thought about divorce, but couldn't go through with it, thinking of my dad. I couldn't betray my dad, who wished for my happiness and was happy about my marriage. Divorce was not an option. Perhaps Thomas sensed this. One day, Thomas went to the in-laws' house alone and returned home the next morning. It was rare for Thomas to go to the in-laws' house by himself. I felt somewhat relieved, but also a bit suspicious. A few days later, I saw a call from a girl on Thomas's mobile phone screen left on the table. Thomas hurried to hide it.
What's with the rush? Who is it? Nothing, a friend. A friend? It's 1 a.m. You're calling someone of the opposite sex at this time?
Thomas had a history of such behavior. When I pressed him, Thomas said irritably,
"You're so annoying. If you have a problem, let's divorce."
At that moment, my obvious distress was a mistake. Thomas seemed to enjoy it. Initially, it was just verbal threats, but eventually, he started brandishing divorce papers, and finally, he presented me with filled-out divorce papers.
"If you don't want to be divorced, listen to what I say."
Against Thomas, who spoke with glee, I found myself unable to resist. It was around that time. Suddenly, Dad died in an accident. I hadn't been able to do enough for him as a filial child. Thomas looked at me with cold eyes as I cried until my head hurt. "Crying will only make you uglier," he said. Dad and I had no relatives. I inevitably took on the role of the chief mourner. Thomas attended the funeral briefly, then left before the cremation. After everything was over, I was in a daze for a while. Then, after the funeral, a man I didn't recognize came to see me. He was a lawyer, commissioned by Dad. "Your dad entrusted me with the matter of his estate." I was happy to hear Dad had left something for me. But considering Dad had let go of his company a few years back, I listened without expectations. And I was shocked.
What? $1.3 billion?
Yes, though there will be deductions.
No way.
What was handed to me were a letter and a will written by Dad himself. Dad had left me an estate worth $1.3 billion. I was bewildered by the enormous amount. According to the lawyer, I had thought Dad's company went under due to financial difficulties, but Dad had actually chosen to sell it. That sale turned into the vast sum of $1.3 billion, now entrusted to me.
I understand, but...
Just being Dad's daughter, should I really inherit such a huge amount of money? As I was frozen, the lawyer smiled. "I've known your dad for a long time. He always wished for your happiness. It may be sudden, but money is not something to be troubled by. Why not accept it as a gesture of his feelings?
But...
I will handle the inheritance procedures and taxes." Looking again at Dad's letter, I nodded. If it was something Dad left wishing for my happiness, I wanted to gratefully accept it.
Thank you.
Thus, I unexpectedly came into a great deal of money. However, I couldn't spend it carelessly. Rather, I didn't want to touch this money. I would keep it safe, and if ever I truly needed help, I would use it. It became a sort of talisman for me. Days passed without me telling anyone about the inheritance. As usual, I was shocked by what I saw when I returned home from work. My debit cards, in my name, were laid out on the living room table. And guarding the debit cards, looking at me, was Thomas.
What are you doing? Taking out my debit cards without asking.
When I tried to take the debit cards, Thomas hid them in his chest pocket and laughed. With a nasty smile.
What am I doing?
That's my line. Hiding such a large sum of money.
That is.
Did you do something bad to get this? Looking up at me, irritated by Thomas, I retorted.
No. This is the inheritance Dad left for me.
I reached out to take back the debit cards from Thomas, but he put them inside his clothes and wouldn't let go.
Give them back! Please!
I thought he was just a lousy president who ran his company into the ground, but to leave such a parting gift. Thomas smirked sarcastically, stood up, and pushed me as I clung to him. I fell on my behind, and he looked down at me with a sneering smile. Don't worry, I'll give back the debit cards. After I've checked everything. Thomas hummed to himself while looking at the debit cards. And after finishing, he threw the debit cards at me.
All in all, $200 million, huh?
In truth, there was more. Just in case, I had spread it across new accounts. Thomas, unaware, smiled contentedly.
With this much, I can quit my job and buy a house. Yeah. I might even take Dad and Mom on that trip they've always wanted.
Thomas started calculating as if the money I inherited was his own, including my detested in-laws.
Don't say whatever you please.
This money was made from the company Dad worked hard to build and sell. It's not Thomas's money to do as he pleases.
This was left for me by Dad. You have no right to dictate how this money is used.
It was a cry from my heart. But Thomas scoffed, waved his hand dismissively. All your money is my money. Cross me, and we're getting a divorce. Emphasizing divorce as if to threaten, Thomas then left the house. Thomas didn't come back after that day. He's probably staying at the in-laws' house as usual. This time, they must be having a blast. Knowing those in-laws and Thomas. dreaming about how to spend the $200 million, no doubt. But those dreams will never come true. The situation has changed now. In the end, Thomas returned home 2 days after he had left. In the evening, as I was vacuuming, I heard the front door open and footsteps. The door connecting the living room and the hallway opened, and Thomas entered with a smile. However, that smile quickly disappeared, and Thomas's eyes widened.
What's this? Ah, see you after 2 days.
I continued to vacuum, unfazed. Thomas said, looking around.
Why is there no furniture, no belongings, nothing?
I turned off the vacuum and smiled. Why? Because this place is getting canceled at the end of the month. Don't worry, your belongings are over there, so you can sort them out yourself. By the end of the month. I pointed to a pile of belongings carelessly placed in a corner. Thomas stood with his mouth agape in shock.
Wait. What do you mean? I don't understand.
It's simple. This place is getting canceled, so we're moving out by the end of the month. I've already moved my stuff out, so you need to figure out what to do with yours. If it's still here by the end of the month, it all gets thrown out.
I don't get why you're canceling it.
Thomas held his head in his hands. There's no need for you to understand. Just leave for now. Ignoring Thomas, I proceeded to continue cleaning. Then, my mobile phone rang. Interrupted again, I answered the call.
Lily?
It was Evelyn. Her voice sounded somewhat cheerful over the phone. Yes, it's Lily.
I heard from Thomas. Good for you.
Silent, Evelyn kept talking. You were always unattractive, unable to have children, and unfriendly. He regretted marrying you, but this time, he's thankful.
What for?
Because you're going on a trip and he's getting a new car, right? Ah, I can't wait. It's good to have a wife who brings in money and a kind son. Unfortunately, I made no such promise. Thomas must have boasted at the in-laws' house. Getting carried away.
I'll buy you anything.
Maybe he said something like, Sorry to interrupt your happiness, but I haven't made any such promises. I have no intention of spending money.
What?
Finally, Evelyn fell silent, and I took a deep breath. You were counting on someone else's money? The money of someone you've always looked down upon? This was the first time I had talked back to Evelyn since getting married. I seemed like a completely different person compared to before. Evelyn remained silent, and Thomas stared at me in astonishment. After waiting a few seconds, no response came from Evelyn. Is that all you wanted to talk about? I'm busy, so if you'll excuse me. I spoke a bit hastily and hung up the phone.
You're being rude to Mom.
Rude? I was just pointing out a mistake. Thomas was complaining, but I ignored him and continued cleaning. 10 minutes later. There was a loud knocking on the door, and the in-laws stood at the entrance. It seemed they rushed over after that phone call.
What's going on, Lily?
As soon as she entered, Evelyn screamed, her face red.
I was so shocked by what you said, I nearly passed out.
If only she had. Charles was nodding beside her. Lily, you might be feeling bold because of the large sum of money, but remember your manners. You're disgraceful. I wanted to throw those words right back at them. Who's the disgraceful one here? You and your son, who consider the inheritance yours as if it were your own, even though my dad has just passed away.
Good.
Who consider the inheritance mine as if it were your own, even though my dad has just passed away. As I trembled with anger, Evelyn reached out her hand towards me.
What? My son's money is my money. Huh?
I tilted my head, and Thomas explained Evelyn's gesture. She means hand over the debit card. You might become greedy and keep it all for yourself. Or, better yet, transfer it to my account now. That would be safer.
That's a great idea.
Can't let the wife have too much money. She might cheat. As the ridiculous family of three got excited, I rolled up the vacuum cleaner cord, propped the unit against the wall, and got ready to leave. Wife, cheating, what are you even talking about?
You should act properly as my wife, as my parents graciously said.
Eh? I'm single, though?
Eh?
Sweat began to form on Thomas's forehead.
What are you talking about, Lily?
Thomas's eyes darted from right to left, restlessly. You said it, didn't you? Divorce if you oppose. I couldn't agree with your opinion, so I took the liberty of divorcing you.
I never approved such a thing.
That's forgery. There's no need for forgery. I pulled out several filled-out divorce applications from my bag and tossed them on the table. The divorce papers fluttered to the floor. Look, all these divorce applications you gave me. Every time I had an opinion, you'd threaten divorce. And each time, you'd shove a filled-out application in my face. How many times had I complied with his unreasonable demands using divorce as a shield? You thought just mentioning divorce would make me comply with everything, didn't you? Thomas swallowed hard. Yes.
Because you didn't want to divorce me, you'd comply again this time, right?
Thomas let out a pathetic voice. You thought I'd comply again because I didn't want to divorce you? Thomas nodded with a distressed look on his face.
Because you love me, right? You want to be with me, don't you?
A sigh escaped me at his gross misunderstanding. Sure, I married him because I loved him. But just because I loved him enough to marry him once doesn't mean it lasts forever. Doesn't he understand that after being so selfish? What an egotist. Unfortunately, I don't love you at all anymore. In fact, I haven't loved you for quite some time.
That can't be. It's a lie.
I hadn't divorced him until now only because I didn't want to worry Dad. I was living a happy married life. I wanted him to think. Looking back, Dad might have seen through it all along. Now that Dad has passed away, there's no reason for me to continue being married to you.
That's why you're moving out of this apartment?
I nodded lightly. Thomas slumped to his knees in defeat. Evelyn hurried over to Thomas.
To dump your loving Thomas just because you got money, that's the lowest.
Charles also looked at me while still standing by Thomas.
Exactly. To make kind Thomas look like this. As an apology, pay compensation, you gold digger.
Compensation? I have the right to receive but no obligation to pay.
What did you say?
Because I've done nothing wrong. Unlike Thomas, who's been unfaithful, I've never cheated. Thomas's face turned pale. Sophia, your colleague Hernandez, and Zoe from the bar, was it? As I counted on my fingers, Thomas's face turned even paler. Evelyn looked away, flustered.
Sophia is different.
Evelyn stuttered. It seemed likely the in-laws knew about Thomas's affairs or even assisted him. It must have been tough helping Thomas create alibis for his affairs. But don't worry. The cameras and voice recorders I planted in Thomas's car and bag did a great job gathering evidence. I made an okay sign with a smile, and all three looked as if it was the end of the world for them.
Please. I accept the divorce, but please, no compensation.
That's right.
Lily, you already have a lot of money. Don't make Thomas suffer unnecessarily.
Is that the first thing that comes to their minds, not an apology? I sighed deeply. That money and Thomas's affairs are unrelated. That's what Dad left for me. What Thomas will pay me is an apology for hurting me. Completely different matters. I intended to demand compensation from his partners as well. That would surely become known around. Demanding from a childhood friend would spread the word among Thomas's friends. At work, it might be discussed by superiors, colleagues, and even acquaintances. The bar might not suffer much, but he'd lose his favorite spot. Thomas couldn't live his life as before.
Lily, wait, listen to me, give me another chance.
Thomas was trembling, tears in his eyes. What chance? Now is my chance. To finally be free of you and your parents. 3 years of marriage. Does Thomas have any idea how hard it's been?
Actually, about the car and the trip, we got excited that day and signed contracts. The trip might be cancelable, but the car dealership has been good to us for years. It's too late to cancel now.
They couldn't pay the compensation because they wanted to use it for those payments. They probably want to say something like that. It has nothing to do with me. I uttered the familiar line as I slipped my feet into my shoes.
Take care, Lily.
I'll leave the matter of compensation to my lawyer. This will be the last time I see you all. Honestly, I don't feel a bit of sadness. Make sure to clean up the stuff properly before you leave. Your parents are here too, so I'm relieved. Well then. I waved my hand and quickly closed the door behind me, heading to my car. Just as I was leaving the parking lot, I saw Thomas chasing after me from the entrance, but I sped up without paying him any mind. And just like that, Thomas was out of sight. Later, according to my lawyer, the former in-laws were quite stubborn. They even complained to my lawyer, who was representing me.
One affair of Thomas should have been overlooked if you were going to divorce anyway. And yet, you insist on demanding compensation. That's right, that's right. It's just a trivial matter. Lily could have just laughed it off and forgiven him. She's so narrow-minded.
My lawyer, shocked by their audacity, responded.
Thomas had not one but 3 affairs. Considering the duration, this cannot be dismissed as trivial. It's a very serious case.
Finally, they fell silent. My lawyer was astonished that Thomas, a grown man, brought his parents to negotiate. He said with a wry smile,
"The way things are, it's unlikely he'll remarry."
As expected, Thomas's affairs became widely known, and his life changed dramatically. Unable to bear the scrutiny, he resigned from his job. Married friends began to avoid him, and with no money, he stopped going out for drinks. Thomas ended up cooped up in his former in-laws' house. As for me, I moved to a distant region following the divorce. It was the hometown of my dad. I wasn't there to look for my grandparents. I just wanted to spend some time in the land where my dad was born and raised. It's a place that's neither too urban nor too rural, just right. Now, I'm living there while working part-time at a local supermarket. Dad's inheritance remains untouched. There were times I was tempted to use it, but each time I thought of Thomas and his family, I restrained myself. Being controlled by money would be the end. What the future holds, I don't know, but right now, I am happy. Someday, when I meet Dad, I want to be able to say I'm genuinely happy, and I intend to live honestly towards that goal.